Hello everybody, a very good morning, 7 o'clock here in the UK. Very welcome to spend your breakfast with us here at Sky News, wherever you're watching us around the world. This morning, President Biden has broken his silence over the crisis in Afghanistan, and his message over the US withdrawal was one of defiance. Will the British government also double down this morning, despite the chaos we've seen at Kabul airport? Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab will be here in the studio in just a few moments' time. In addition to that, 7:45, we're joined by a former British Army officer and author to discuss where the US and UK went wrong in Afghanistan. It's Tuesday, the 17th of August. President Biden says he stands squarely behind the Afghanistan withdrawal, saying the blame for the Taliban takeover lies elsewhere.
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
I'm in Washington reflecting on a decision and a speech which could define Joe Biden's presidency.
Coming home in the last few moments, another British evacuation flight has touched down at RAF Bryce Norton.
And we're here at RAF Bryce Norton as British troops get ready to fly out to Afghanistan.
And after the chaotic and tragic scenes at Kabul airport yesterday, Britain and America are now sending more troops to secure the runway. Flights have now resumed as the mission to evacuate foreign nationals becomes a race against time.
Flown to safety in Qatar, the image showing hundreds of Afghan refugees aboard a US Air Force jet.
Mostly dull and damp for many places today, but there will be some sunshine for some. I'll have the details for you later.
Morning, everybody. The US President Joe Biden has insisted he stands squarely behind his decision to withdraw US forces from Afghanistan. The president returned from Camp David last night to break his silence on the chaos in Kabul since the Taliban seized the city. Mr. Biden called the scenes in Kabul gut-wrenching, but he blamed the Taliban's takeover on the Afghan political leaders who fled the country and the army, which he called unwilling to fight. Our US correspondent Mark Stone reports.
For a week, he's been silent, a week in which a decision that he made has played out with alarming chaos. Now, back from his holiday back in the White House, President Biden faced the biggest test of his presidency.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
The core of his carefully scripted argument was that staying there would have been futile.
There is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
But then what of the timing and the manner of the U.S. pullout?
The scenes we're seeing in Afghanistan, they're gut-wrenching, particularly for our veterans, our diplomats, humanitarian workers, for anyone who has spent time on the ground working to support the Afghan people.
A month ago in the same room, words which now sound so naive.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comfortable.
Now, with an all-American backdrop, he danced a fine line for a home audience, claiming in one breath that this was the right decision, the only decision, but then arguing that he was forced to follow through on a bad deal with the Taliban struck by Donald Trump.
Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021.
In other words, he argues that his withdrawal was more controlled than Mr. Trump's would have been. He does know that a decision that was on him has caused unease and upset among allies and more than a wry smile from foes. But this speech wasn't for them. So what now? The president had this.
We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy and engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls.
And so it was a doubling down of his decision. No regrets. This was a message for the people of America, not for the people of Afghanistan. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Martha standing by for us in Washington this morning. Morning to you, Martha. Good evening, I suppose, where you are, very early hours of the morning. He came, he spoke, he left again, didn't take any questions.
Yeah, he left again back to his country retreat, Camp David. He'd cut his holiday short in order to make this urgent address to the American people. There was very little in that speech in the way of regret or remorse for the scenes that we see unfolding in Afghanistan. Instead, what we got was a clear-eyed defence of the decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. He said he could not and he would not send another generation of America's sons and daughters to war in Afghanistan. It was a very emotive use of language to appeal to an American audience. This was an American-centric speech. Some here have called it callous and insensitive because there really was very little to appeal to the people of Afghanistan. We did see, or we did hear, an acknowledgement that some of those images that we've seen out of the country over the last couple of days have been gut-wrenching. He admitted that the book does stop with him. But yet, equally, there still wasn't a real explanation for the chaos we've seen unfolding in Afghanistan. Given that there was such a clear timetable for withdrawal, why is it all so frenzied now? And why was there not a better plan put in place to extract some of the Afghan citizens who have worked alongside US troops over the past 2 decades? And it's those images of desperation among the Afghan people which are so damaging, not only for America's reputation internationally, but also for President Biden's standing domestically. Those images of people clinging to the undercarriage of US Air Force jets, those images of people running alongside those same jets in such a desperate attempt to escape. Now, President Biden, as you were mentioning, Kay, did use this speech to point the finger at various parties, whether that be the Afghan army, who he said were unwilling to fight, whether that be the deal that he inherited from President Trump. Tonight, we've also heard from another former president, the president who took America to war in Afghanistan, President Bush, saying that America have responsibility and resource to secure safe passage to Afghan citizens. Now, if President Biden is to find anything to redeem what's been a foreign policy disaster, then it will be finding as many people as possible, as many Afghan citizens as possible, safe passage to the US.
OK, for now, Martha, thanks very much. Thank you for the update. Well, in the last few minutes, another British evacuation flight has landed at RAF Bryce Norton. This was a scene earlier this morning in Oxfordshire as the RAF Hercules touched down. Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said 150 British nationals would be arriving back in the UK in the early hours of this morning. The Foreign Secretary said a further 350 Britons and Afghan nationals will be arriving in the coming days, while another 200 British soldiers will be heading to Kabul to support the evacuation. Our correspondent Charlotte Lomas is at RAF Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire for us this morning. Hello to you, Charlotte. So another plane with more relieved people on board.
Absolutely, and we are expecting more British Armed Force troops to head out in the other direction and head out to Afghanistan. We know the numbers have risen to 900, with a further 200 troops being announced by the Ministry of Defence today. Now, that is the push to try and bring more UK nationals home, but also to secure the safety of selected Afghans. And this decision does come after those frantic scenes that we saw saw at Kabul airport that Martha just touched on there in her correspondence with you, just really trying to make controlling the airport easier. So hoping by adding additional troops and sending more British troops out there that will assist in the evacuation from Afghanistan.
OK, Charlotte, thank you. Foreign Secretary is with us in the studio now. Hello to you, Foreign Secretary. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. To the outside world, it appears what's going on in Kabul is absolute chaos. What's your understanding?
Well, I got a situation update this morning. The position at the airport is stabilising. There's been a surge of US and UK troops. We've got 600 extra personnel there. It's critically important, not just for the stability on the ground for Afghans, but critically for our evacuation effort. We've made real progress. We had 150 British nationals come out on Sunday. Over the last week, we've also had 289 of those Afghan nationals who have served the UK so loyally in Afghanistan. And we expect over the next 24 hours to have 350 more, both British nationals and Afghan nationals who've worked for us coming out. So the situation is stabilising, but obviously we're monitoring it very carefully.
Ben Wallace told me yesterday and again last Friday that we needed something like 1,500 people a day to come out.
Well, it depends if you're talking about the ARAP programme or nationals. We've had...
It doesn't matter, does it? It's chaos, though. We need to get them out.
Well, but actually, I think getting our British nationals out, of course, there's something like 2,000, the figure is changing all the time, who have contacted us. So that's a much smaller figure. In terms of ARAP, yes, we want to get all of those out as well. ARAP, of course, is those, whether it's translators or other Afghans who have loyally served the UK. So we're doing everything we can, but obviously it depends on the security situation on the ground. That's why we're putting in 600 of our own personnel. I spoke to Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, yesterday. They're upping every hour and every day the security that they need, including crowd control to deal with the surge of Afghans
happened yesterday?
who are seeking to get out, given the Taliban takeover.
What happened yesterday?
Well, I think given the Taliban takeover, given the nervousness, the fear on the ground, you've seen a lot of people effectively heading for the door. And we've got to make sure that we can stabilise the situation. And I think ultimately British people would expect us, and I'm sure the American public the same, to prioritise our nationals, including dual nationals in Afghanistan, but also those who have so loyally served us. That's what we're doing.
OK. A large number of thugs is what I read in this morning's newspapers that are on their way to Kabul. This uneasy peace that is in place at the moment is very soon going to be shattered. What's your intelligence on that?
Well, we don't talk about intelligence, as you know.
You must be concerned about it, though.
Well, there are reports all the time. The situation is very fluid. The Taliban have exerted control far more rapidly than we expect. There will be dissenting rebel voices and actions. What we want to see at the moment is two things. One, the evacuation conducted as stably as possible. We've had assurances at the higher level from the Taliban publicly through the Taliban Political Commission in Doha and through third parties. I spoke to the Qatari Foreign Minister and the Pakistani Foreign Minister. They've made all sorts of commitments in the Doha Agreement, which dates back to 2020. We expect to hold them to account to that. And secondly, then there is the medium-term strategy, which must mean making sure that Afghanistan can't be used by terrorist groups to attack neighbours or the West again, trying to provide the humanitarian relief that the people in Afghanistan need, given the hugely unstable situation you've described. That's going to be very challenging. We won't obviously be giving aid directly to the Taliban. We do want to provide humanitarian relief to the civilian population. And I think there's a much broader question about stabilising that region and how we engage with those countries who are going to be very difficult, but will have a stake in trying to stabilise the situation, from Pakistan, India to China, all with very different views. We've got to show the international leadership to try and bring some stability and a positive track forward.
More than that, Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, is very worried about UK-based groups which have been radicalised that could cause problems here in the UK. How worried are you about that?
Well, look, we listened to Ken and the Home Secretary and the law enforcement operations here. We track that very, very carefully. Of course, what happens in the Middle East, we know, can have a ricochet effect back in the UK. But what I do know is that Ken and the MI5 team and all of our law enforcement are absolutely red hot on making sure that we protect British nationals and the UK. That's our number one priority.
Is he right to be worried? Ben Wallace says he is.
I think it's always right the head of MI5 is alert and sensitive to all changes abroad that will have a security implication in the UK.
OK. I want to go back to the people that are coming out of Afghanistan. I've been speaking to a lot of your colleagues. They're absolutely furious that they say about 20,000 Afghan nationals need to return to the UK because they are either people that work for us directly or their families who are in extreme danger if they stay there.
Yeah.
Is that the sort of number that you're looking at?
Well, the total numbers are being processed by through the ARAP scheme. We've got 3,300 Afghan nationals and their families out to date. I think we're the highest number proportionately of all of our allies. So I think it's been very difficult, but we've made good progress. We want to now stabilise that airport and get as many of them out as we possibly can.
But how many are
look,
do you recognise that number?
Well, I'm not sure about the number exactly, but look, they're clearly in the thousands because we've got 3,300 out already. We want to get as many of them as we physically can out. But of course, it depends on the stability of the situation on the ground, which is why we come back to the point that you mentioned earlier, rightly. The stability at the airport is absolutely key. And I've been working very closely with Ben Wallace and the Home Secretary to make sure we can do everything we can, give ourselves the capacity every day to get as many out as quickly as we can, given the window of opportunity for that.
Do you agree with your Defence Secretary that, sadly, some people will be left behind?
I think there's always a risk of that. What I'm focused on is just doing everything physically possible to get British nationals out, to get as many of those who've loyally served us out, and also to think about how we then move forward with an international strategy which can stabilise the situation for the people of Afghanistan.
Under what timescale are you hoping to be able to do that?
I think it's difficult to say because the situation is so fluid. We were all caught by surprise by the speed and pace and scale of the Taliban takeover. The Americans have talked about the end of August, but ultimately we need to get people out as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, and it will depend on the security situation on the ground. But to come back to the point, I do think, and having spoken to Tony Blinken, my opposite number yesterday, do think that the airport is more stable today than it was yesterday, and we need to make sure that we consolidate that in the days ahead.
OK. Given that you said that not just you, but many were taken by surprise, not least the Americans as well, how disappointed are you that our military top brass didn't know that this was coming?
Well, it's not just a question, by the way, of the military. We have an assessment process. We've looked at it for... since I become Foreign Secretary, I've been in the NSC's National Security Council meetings. We've monitored this very carefully. But the truth is, across the world, people were caught by surprise. I haven't spoken to an international interlocutor, including countries in the region, over the last week who hasn't been surprised. But the reality is...
to predict better after 20 years in the country.
Well, yeah, but we saw a very swift change in the dynamics. And of course, this has been part and parcel of the withdrawal of Western troops. But it's also been the way and the approach of the Taliban. And of course, it's been a test for the Afghan security forces. All of those factors have been very fluid. But no one saw this coming. Of course, we would have taken action if we had.
But I get that. My question is, shouldn't we have?
I think it's easy to say that with the benefit of hindsight, but the truth is you're always measuring a very fluid constellation matrix, if you like, of risk factors, and that's the reality.
Is the Taliban an organisation that you can do business with?
Ordinarily, you'd say no. They don't share our standards of human rights. They don't
that doesn't stop us dealing with China.
They don't treat women the way that
doesn't stop us dealing with China.
Well, I think we're going to have to be pragmatic, as the UK policy has always been. We've engaged through the political commission of the Taliban in Doha. It's important we engage through third parties. That's why I spoke to my Qatari foreign minister. We're going to need to be able to send clear messages, and our message is going to be this: Afghanistan must never be used to launch terrorist attacks against the West. We've had 20 years of success in that regard. We've had a range of other successes. We've seen 10 million more children in education that never saw a school book since 2001. Many of those young girls. We've cleared 8 million landmines. So we have secured gains in that 20 years. Clearly, they're now at risk. Yeah. What we want to do is everything we can through the full range of diplomatic, economic sanction measures to make sure we can use as much leverage as we conceivably have, and I'm realistic about that, to try and moderate and exercise some form of positive influence around the regime ahead. And of course, there is still, and it may be a low chance of this, still these talks that are going on through the Taliban's political commission, which is based in Doha, to try and make sure that there's a transitional government which isn't just purely Taliban. Now, I think we need to be realistic.
You can't trust the Taliban, surely.
You can't, but at least as long as there's a process that they're engaged in, I think we need to test it.
They're a ragtag bunch of thugs.
Look, I'm not going to dissent from that view, but they are now in power, and we now need to deal with that reality. And all I'm just saying is, we don't have to be optimistic about it. As long as there is an engagement via that process, we want to test whether there is scope to moderate the kind of regime that we will now see in place.
Do we rule out returning to Afghanistan in some numbers at some stage in the future?
Look, I can't take a crystal ball out and...
Not asking you to, I'm saying, are you going to rule that out? Or
we're clearly...
That seems what Biden's done.
We're clearly withdrawing. We said when we went into Afghanistan, NATO said we'd go in together, we adapted together, and we'd leave together. So we now need to deal with that reality.
How sorry are you that you didn't return from your holiday earlier?
Look, as I said, everyone was caught off guard by the pace scale of the Taliban takeover. The reality is, as a foreign secretary, all foreign secretaries are in this position when we're abroad, whether it's for travel, for work or for holiday, we are there able to respond to events. So I was engaged in Cobra, talking to foreign counterparts, directly speaking to the head of our team here in London. I was doing that on an hour-by-hour basis, and of course I left as soon as the situation deteriorated and demanded it.
Understood. But you and the Prime Minister, I mean, you're the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, both of you, on holiday at the same time while Afghanistan was going to hell in a handcart. Was that a dereliction of duty?
No, I don't think that's the right description. Look, the reality is...
How would you describe it?
Well, look, we've been monitoring the situation in Afghanistan since the 2020 Doha Agreement. Very carefully, it's been very fluid. From my point of view, at any point in time, I will have 8 to 10 simmering issues that can bubble up. And we always...
But not like this.
Yes, I'm afraid, Kay, it may not always be in the media eye, but actually situations where we have to keep a very close eye. I always have to be...
Looking at one of the biggest airlifts since the Second World War.
Well, but we didn't predict that we would be doing this on this scale because of the Taliban takeover. But look, in retrospect, of course, I wouldn't have gone on holiday if I'd have known that being the case. Equally, after 18 months and 2 years of a very grueling, demanding schedule, I think it's right that people in those positions try and take some leave, but we're always ready, I'm always ready to come back. And of course, the key point that I was making is, even when I was away, frankly, I wouldn't have gone away if I'd have known that. I was constantly handling and managing meetings, talking to foreign counterparts, and because of technology, of course, able to engage in every one of the Cobra meetings.
I was speaking to a former soldier yesterday who lost both of his legs in Afghanistan. He said he picked up bits of his mate on the road in Afghanistan. He says that it was all for nothing.
My heart goes out to anyone that has served their country and suffered those kind of losses and seen what he will have seen. He has served his country loyally, and I think he should be proud of what he's achieved. As I mentioned before, we were there 20 years. We have, in that time, not seen a terrorist group attack the West from Afghanistan. We have seen...
I know, but what's going to happen
Hold on.
next?
But it wasn't all for nothing. 10 million children in education, many of them girls. 8 million landmines cleared. We did that with our partners. Just so you know, for mothers, the maternal fatality rate, so the number of mothers that lost their life in childbirth or in pregnancy, down by almost a half.
But what now?
So we achieved those things, but now the question is, with the Taliban in place, and what are the levers we've got to moderate what comes next, and to make sure that the gains aren't lost?
What do you think?
So first, my answer to him would be his service was not in vain, but we've got a hell of a challenge now. We will use all the levers that we've got, whether it's economic tools, sanctions, the diplomatic leverage. I think what's going to be important in the terms of the diplomacy is working with all the countries in the region as well as the traditional partners. India will matter. China and Russia will matter. Difficult interlocutors for us. Pakistan will matter. Sure. All of those have got to, with us, work to provide some stability. And we've started that in the Security Council. We use our G7 presidency. We'll use the UN General Assembly coming up in September. I think we need a contact group of those regional and key partners. And I think we need to see some international leadership, and we'll be working very closely with the UN and those partners to achieve that.
I must let you go. Thank you for being open and honest as always. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Let's bring in our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, shall we, who's standing by for us this morning. Hello to you, Alistair. Very good morning. Your thoughts? Good morning.
Morning, Kay. Well, look, let's first start off with Dominic Raab's assessment of the situation on the ground this morning. Sounds like more positive news at Kabul airport. The only caveat I would say is I think, if my memory serves me correctly, things were rather calmer this time yesterday morning before they started spiralling out of control as the day wore on. But I think the introduction of more US and British troops when they arrive will help that security operation to keep the runway clear and to allow military flights to arrive and take off again. And if we get to a situation where flights are able to come in and out with some regularity, then I think we'll see a far swifter operation to help repatriate the foreigners who are stuck in Kabul. The second point that I picked up on was a slight change of tone I detected in the potential future approach towards in the last days and weeks. The message from the international community, from the West, was very much that the Taliban would not be internationally recognized as a government. My personal view on that was always that that was somewhat short-sighted because they didn't really take into account what Russia and China, perhaps Pakistan, Iran would do with the Taliban. And already we've seen Russia and China reach out tentatively towards the new Taliban administration. However, Dominic Raab, in that interview with you there, suggesting that they would, if possible, look at ways of having some sort of dialogue, some sort of interaction with the Taliban government. It is very early days, or we don't even know the makeup of the Taliban administration yet. And you do have that third-party conduit in Qatar to deal with if necessary. But I just felt it was a slight change of tone, that if the British government feels that it can not do business with, not do trade with, not become partners with, but if the British government feels that it can have some sort of relationship with the Taliban, then that might be something they pursue. And as I say, I think that is a slight change in tone.
OK, Alistair, for now, thank you. Still to come on the programme for you, President Biden doubles down on the US withdrawal. Next, I'll be speaking to a member of his predecessor, Donald Trump's National Security Council. 8:30, we'll be speaking to a US war veteran about the current state of Afghanistan following President Biden's decision to withdraw US troops. And in case you missed it last night, later in the programme, we'll have a full replay of President Biden's defiant address to the nation. That's at 9:30 this morning. Looking at the morning's other news stories for you now, and heavy rain has begun to batter Haiti as the country tries to recover from a recent earthquake, which killed more than 1,400 people. Forecasters think up to 15 inches of rain could fall during Tropical Depression Grace. Families have tried to escape the rain at a makeshift camp for people whose homes collapsed during the quake. Bob Dylan has been accused of historical sex abuse allegations dating back more than 50 years. The singer-songwriter is being sued over claims he molested a 12-year-old girl in New York in 1965. A spokesperson for Dylan, who's now 80, said the allegations were false and will be vigorously defended. Government launching a plan to cut emissions by using hydrogen as an alternative to oil and gas. It's hoped hydrogen will play a key role in cutting carbon in energy-intensive industries and could account for up to 35% of the UK's energy consumption by 2050. Right, what's happening as far as the weather is concerned? Naz is standing by for us this morning, looking gorgeous as always. Good morning, Naz. Good morning, Naz.
Good morning. Thank you, Kay. Weather's not looking so gorgeous. It's looking quite dull and damp, in fact, for many places today, but a lucky few seeing some sunny spells.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. It's a dull and damp affair for the rest of this week across much of the UK and Ireland. There will be a few breaks in the cloud at times, allowing for some sunny spells, but it's also going to be quite cool for the time of year as we continue with a northerly flow. Now, at the moment, most places starting off quite cloudy, some patches of mist, fog, also light rain and drizzle, quite persistent downpours across northern parts of England and Wales and eastern parts of England too. Now, going into this afternoon, we will continue to see patchy light rain and drizzle, particularly across parts of the northwest of England and Wales, Northern Ireland, the north of the Republic too. The rain across eastern parts of England tending to ease slowly away, but generally cloudy and damp there today. Scotland, on the other hand, becoming drier and brighter, and there will be some breaks in the cloud for southwestern parts of the UK and Ireland, where we're likely to see the highest temperatures today. But obviously, under the cloud cover and the drizzly rain, it will be feeling much cooler elsewhere.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello again. US President Joe Biden has insisted that he stands squarely behind his decision to withdraw US forces from Afghanistan. Addressing the nation last night, he added that American troops should not fight a war Afghan forces are not willing to fight themselves. Robert Spalding, a former member of President Trump's National Security Council, joining us now from Washington. Hello to you, sir. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. I believe that you agree with what President Biden has been saying. What about the turmoil that's been left behind?
Well, I think, as I said, I agree with, essentially most of what Joe Biden said during his announcement about Afghanistan. I think that the challenge is that this was poorly planned. It could have gone much better. And I think, the Pentagon, certainly the intelligence community, really, I think in this case, let the president down, because I think it was well known that as we said we were going to depart, this thing was going to collapse very, very quickly.
President Trump wanted them out in May, didn't he?
Well, yes, but there's also a way that you get out, and that is, if you remember in the announcement that President Biden made, we said, the Afghan government asked us not to evacuate people because they didn't want to cause a crisis of confidence. Well, in allowing the Afghanistan government what they wanted, and then the Afghanistan government fled the country, it really led to this chaos. And so I think what we should have done is actually plan for this collapse, and then we would have been much better prepared than having to send an additional 6,000 troops, and you see the chaos on the ground.
It doesn't help when a previous president gives the enemy the timeline, though.
Well, again, it doesn't matter the timeline. What matters, are you prepared for the conditions that are going to come? That's why we do tremendous planning in the military in order to prepare for these eventualities. It's clear that their planning was not done to ensure a proper evacuation of the country. This is not about timelines. This is really about what was planned for.
But if you leave if you organise an evacuation, do you not leave a vacuum? What does that mean for the people left behind? You take away, you leave them with the firepower, I suppose, and certainly the hardware, but you take away the manpower.
Ultimately, this is Afghanistan's country. It's for their government and their people to decide the fate of Afghanistan. It's not for the United States or any other country. And I think we spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of lives. Really, what we need to do, and what I think democracies everywhere need to do, is focus on their citizens, ensure that they're prosperous, that they're safe, that they're free. And I think in doing so, we're going to show the rest of the world why democracy is such a good, way to go. What's happened since the end of the Cold War is we've focused on external wars. We've focused on peace everywhere and tried to fight for that peace. In reality, what we should have been is building democracies like we did after the end of World War II throughout the Cold War. We stopped doing that when the Cold War ended.
Didn't work well in Afghanistan, did it, trying to build a democracy? It's a country that you invaded 2 decades ago, summarily dissected, and look what's happened now.
When I say building, I'm talking about things like the Marshall Plan. I'm talking about the rebuilding of Japan and Korea after World War II. I'm talking about the focus on innovation, technology, talent, and capital being going into democracies after World War II. The thing that won the Cold War was not fighting. It was not war. It was the building of democracies and the prosperity of individuals in those democracies, citizens really, that really led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of our military might. The Soviet Union collapsed because we had a more compelling model. Today, the innovation, technology, talent, and capital from democracies has gone over to authoritarian governments, primarily China, and have been used to displace workers and have really led to the demise of democracy for the last 30 years. And so if we're going to rebuild, and that's really what the Trump administration's national security strategy was about, rebuilding democracies, we have to actually build. When you say building democracy in Afghanistan, fighting a war in Afghanistan is not building democracy. Building democracy is building infrastructure, manufacturing, science and technology, investing in education. Those are the things that we invested in during the Cold War.
But soldiers can transform into peacekeepers for a country that is basically a fledgling country. It's only 2 decades old to all intents and purposes. The teenagers who are in Kabul and wider Afghanistan now haven't known life under the Taliban. They wear jeans, they play on their video games. They haven't known what it was like under the Taliban. They're going to have to find out very quickly indeed. What's the US going to do? Just wash their hands of those young people now?
Well, I think one of the issues that you're talking about, particularly a good example would be Japan. MacArthur actually ran Japan as the ruling authority for a long time. And the United States really stayed there. We're still there. We're still in Japan. We're still in Germany. So what you're suggesting is that the United States should stay in Afghanistan. And I think what the president said is correct, and that is that the United States has no national security incentive to stay in Afghanistan if the people in Afghanistan aren't willing to actually fight for themselves. And I think this is accurate. Japan stood up. Germany stood up. They're a thriving democracy. Afghanistan, in particular because of its association with Pakistan and the fact that the Pakistan ISI is supporting the Taliban and terrorists, was never going to be a thriving democracy, no matter how many decades the United States was there. In order to fix Afghanistan, you would have to also fought Pakistan. There's no way either the United States or any of its allies and partners wanted to do that.
OK, I think I'm right in saying that a third of the Afghan population is under the age of 18. What about them?
Well, again, it's up to the government of Afghanistan. If the international, if the UN, if the international order wants to move in, and I don't think they do. In fact, China's made it very clear that they want to partner with the Taliban. Saudi Arabia has recognized the Taliban government. I think what we have to do today, if we're going to really look for making people's lives better in this world, we have to focus on showing that our model, the model of democracy, the model of free trade, the model where we take care of our citizens is a better model. We're not going to get there by invading countries and then trying to make them like us. We have to inspire them. We have to inspire them to want the kind of lives that we have because our citizens live great lives. That is the promise of democracy. That's what our national security is built on, is what we can deliver for our own citizens in our own countries.
We appreciate you staying up late to talk to us on the programme this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just confirming, in 2019, 42.47% of Afghanistan's population was under the age of 14. Speaking on the programme a little earlier, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, said the situation at Kabul airport is being stabilised and good progress is being made on the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans. And he told me the UK government will engage with the Taliban through third parties, despite admitting that the UK would not ordinarily do business with them.
They don't share our standards of human rights. They don't
that doesn't
treat,
stop us dealing with China.
They don't treat women the way that
doesn't stop
we
us
want.
dealing with China.
Well, I think we're going to have to be pragmatic, as the UK policy has always been. We've engaged through the political commission of the Taliban in Doha. It's important we engage through third parties. That's why I spoke to my Qatari foreign minister. We're going to need to be able to send clear messages, and our message is going to be this: Afghanistan must never be used to launch terrorist attacks against the West. We've had 20 years of success in that regard. We've had a range of other successes. We've seen 10 million more children in education that never saw a school book since 2001. Many of those young girls. We've cleared 8 million landmines. So we have secured gains in that 20 years. Clearly, they're now at risk. Yep. What we want to do is everything we can through the full range of diplomatic, economic sanction measures to make sure we can use as much leverage as we conceivably have, and I'm realistic about that, to try and moderate and exercise some form of positive influence around the regime ahead. And of course, there is still, and it may be a low chance of this, still these talks that are going on through the Taliban's political commission, which is based in Doha, to try and make sure that there's a transitional government which isn't just purely Taliban. Now, I think we need to be realistic.
You can't trust the Taliban, surely.
You can't, but at least as long as there's a process that they're engaged in, I think we need to test it.
They're a ragtag bunch of thugs.
Look, I'm not going to dissent from that view, but they are now in power, and we now need to deal with that reality.
Tamara is here. Thoughts, Tamara?
Well, Dominic Raab essentially admitting that we need to deal with the Taliban, not directly, through third parties and if possible, as an international community. But this is not back to the 1990s where they were pariahs. Now that there is this threat from terrorism, he conceded that events abroad can ricochet back to the UK in terms of radicalisation. We've had a warning today from the director of MI5 about that. And he says we will need to deal with them through a process in order to try and prevent it becoming a haven for al-Qaeda again. But clearly his immediate focus in the next couple of days is the evacuation. He said that 2,000 British nationals remain in Afghanistan. I think that's a bit less than we thought, but he says those numbers are changing all the time and urged people there to make themselves known to the authorities.
He did seem to give hope to the suggestions that interpreters and their families and others that have worked for the British government or the British people will be able to come back as well.
Look, he says that over 3,000 are already in Britain. That is over the long term. The rules eased up a bit in May, and there was criticism that the rules were too tight, that people who'd worked for private contractors or had been made redundant from their jobs were not able to come over. Now we've seen this scramble. We know that there have been Home Office officials sent out to Kabul airport to help skim through all these applications because, as senior government officials make clear, we need to do those checks to make sure we're not allowing the wrong people onto the planes. But certainly, as Ben Wallace broke down yesterday in an interview saying, we're not going to get everybody because the conditions on the ground, Taliban roadblocks in Kabul, are simply going to make it too difficult for people who haven't got their paperwork in place to do so.
OK, for now, thanks, Tamara. Tomorrow's take at 9 o'clock this morning. Meantime, as the blame game continues over Afghanistan, going to be speaking to a former British Army officer about where it all went wrong. We've been hearing from the Foreign Secretary this morning. He tells us that the situation in Kabul, particularly the airport, is much calmer this morning, and another aircraft has landed at RAF Brize Norton with more relieved people arriving back in the UK. The political blame game over the failings in Afghanistan continues meantime. Let's get the very latest now, should we, with Mike Martin, who is an author of An Intimate War. Hello to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. What do you make of the speed in which the Taliban managed to take over Kabul?
It's been absolutely blistering. And it's, the Foreign Secretary said that he was surprised at the speed at which it was done. The Taliban was surprised at the speed at which it was done. I think that one point that is important to make is that this wasn't so much a Taliban victory as a government collapse. The government in Afghanistan just completely collapsed without effectively the Western firepower supporting it.
How can the top brass not have known that that was going to happen, both in the UK and the US, given that they've been on the ground for 2 decades? They know these people. They know who's in charge of the government or previous government.
Yeah, I think our generals are military people, obviously, they're not politicians, but the failure in Afghanistan was actually a political one. So we went about how we wanted to reconstruct Afghanistan in quite a technical way, clinics built, schools built, elections run, so on and so forth. What we, the coalition, failed to do was to support or force the Afghan government to build a broad-based enough political coalition of all the clans, tribes, warlords, militias. Afghanistan's very factionalized. The Afghan government didn't build a strong enough political coalition, and that meant that the Taliban were able to peel off members in different provinces and districts of the government security apparatus into their coalition. And finally, with that weak edifice without foundations that the West had constructed, the manner of our exit, the speed at which it was conducted, the leaving of Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night, the forcing of the Afghan government to release Taliban prisoners by the United States, effectively gave this house of cards a shove, and it collapsed.
Almost as fast as the former president, who allegedly has left the country with several aeroplanes and cars full of money. What has he left behind? You talked about the Taliban being able to peel off certain factions, but we had someone who I'm sure you'll know, the leader of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, on the programme yesterday, and Lord Dannatt as well, both saying that now we need to worry about a civil war.
It's too early to tell. Certainly, the predictions that many of us were making, myself included, that have all turned out to be wrong, were that this would probably stalemate by October. There are certainly questions about the degree to which the Taliban are fragmented. They, like every country, they're very factionalized. Political parties are made up of different constituencies. But within the Taliban, there are real questions over what their relationship with China is going to be, for instance, because of China's persecution of the Uyghurs. What's their policy on drugs? What's their policy on women? Bring to you that this morning the Afghan news networks restarted again with female anchors just now wearing slightly more conservative headscarves. And so the different factions of the Taliban have these very different views on what constitutes Sharia, God's law, Islam, all the rest of it. And so that is a real question. I think the other question is, and this is why we haven't seen a Taliban government being announced, is that they are trying to invite non-Talibs to be ministers. So the Taliban will, of course, handle security, defense, religious affairs, but other portfolios, I don't know, the Ministry of Infrastructure, may well go to non-Talibs. And so I think what's going on now is that the Taliban leadership are trying to build up a cabinet that is acceptable to their many fragmented factions, as well as acceptable to the international community. And so this is where we start to see players like Hamid Karzai, who I'm sure many of your listeners will remember, the former president of Afghanistan. He perhaps might be, some people are touting him as the new foreign minister to help the Taliban government gain the international recognition that Dominic Raab was talking about earlier.
Okay, Mike Martin, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme.